Cheers, everyone. Okay, let's get myself comfortable. Oh, I'll just stop that. Well, I hope you're all happy today, having a good weekend. I've had a very, very busy, productive weekend. I hope some of you caught my earlier video explaining why I'm late producing this reading book video. Yeah. I've been installing an above-ground pool, and you see some pictures, you'll see the video, and right now we're putting water to her. So let's bring this down a little bit. Okay, where you can see me. Anyways, today is chapter 3 in our book reading, and by the way, I forgot to mention some things that it's remiss of me. Okay, so there is a note to the reader. I forgot to explain this when I started off the book readings. If you should buy my book, where large sections, usually whole chapters of the book, would have been italicized, indicating dialogue or scenes of internal thought, telepathy, or an altered state of mind, in order to make reading such lengthy sections easier on the eyes, just the chapter title was italicized, followed by 3 dots, identifying this change in format. 3 dots are still utilized at the start of the chapter paragraph to denote the beginning or continuation of the aforementioned internal thought, people thinking to yourselves, and or altered state of mind sequence. Anyways, and this is a book of fiction. I haven't met any aliens of late. So, chapter 3. We'll start right away because it is kind of late. How many pages do we have to read? Well, it's going to be a long one. 2 families and their uninvited guests. No good news from Jackie yet, other than Frank not appearing to be in any pain. I just got back from trying to settle my dad down. No small task, considering his mindset and generally negative disposition, even at the best of times. I've instructed Bernie to add more salt, sugar, and other spices to his meals in an effort to somehow enhance the flavor. Hopefully, that may appease him. He's definitely not an easy person to console in his present state of mind. Some like me. As for the rest of us, we will have to do with less. We don't want to deplete our limited stock of condiments too fast, as we don't know when or even if we can ever replenish them. That's a troubling thought. So it was something Bill casually said in the presence of my dad that caused him to panic and hunker down in his Grampy suite. It was kind of funny, though. For a man who claims to be a staunch Protestant, has no use for the Pope, Catholicism, and its dogmas, he sure took Bill's offhanded suggestion that this was purgatory to heart. I'm amazed he didn't give himself an aneurysm. I had to assure him that if this were purgatory, Frank wouldn't be in a coma. There would be no pets like Cadfael, my mongrel Basset Beagle hound, to sit on his lap as he was doing at the time, trying to comfort him, as only a dog can do. I reminded him of the story in the New Testament, the parable of the beggar and the rich man, where Jesus actually describes hell, how both men died, and the righteous beggar went to heaven, but the wicked rich man went to hell. It was obviously the rich man could see his predicament and experience thirst. I asked Dad if he was thirsty or if he could see, and of course he couldn't because he's blind, but though he did ask for a beer. So if you were being punished by God, I suggested, you'd be able to see your circumstances and any horrors he might want you to witness, and you definitely wouldn't get a beer. I reminded him there would be nothing to drink, especially beer, and no food, bland as it was for him to enjoy, if he were truly dead. Also, as dead people don't have physical bodies, and as he can't see, he has to rely on touch. I assured him you can't touch or feel ghosts, and gave him a reassuring hug. Obviously, my visit was successful, because he asked me to have Bernie bring him something to eat along with that beer. Imagine that, I bellowed within earshot as I was leaving. He was, after all, partially deaf. A good Protestant fretting about being in a Catholic purgatory. It was only then the thought occurred to me, so what must the others be fretting about? I am feeling a lot better about myself at the moment. After leaving Dad and before I returned to my den to resume writing, I took a quick walk around the outside perimeter of the property, re-examining the extent of the damage done to the fence. This time around, I happened to notice some peculiar markings on in the charring of the surrounding old growth trees. Those not so old trees that were here before our arrival. Yeah. The scarring and damage wasn't uniform. The fencing was obviously the conduit for the energy surge that enveloped us and the whole property and then radiated outwards. Okay. Otherwise, there would have been extensive damage, or worse, inside the boundaries. Yet some sections of my fence had melted and carbonized as well. That would indicate that the power wasn't consistent or of equal distribution throughout the event. It would also explain the severity of the damage inflicted on one of the modules. It must have acted like a fuse, which is bad news for us because we don't have any spare fuses. That little revelation was not at all comforting or encouraging. For now, I'll keep that bit of information to myself. Anyways, I got to thinking so much power had to emanate from some other source. There was no way that surge of energy originated from those lightning strikes. The property's hydro lines would never have been able to handle that magnitude of electricity without melting. Lightning might be able to hurl a DeLorean through time, but not my whole property. No, this power source had to originate from somewhere or something else. As I continued to walk around the property, I reflected on the events of the day that led up to our catastrophe. The sudden onset of clouds and that peculiar haziness that portended a coming thunderstorm. Just like the sequence of events that occurred on that night the spaceship crashed into the lake. Damn! Like a flash of lightning, it dawned on me. I'll wager there was another spaceship in our immediate vicinity. It was probably producing and manipulating the very events that brought about this whole disaster. Now the question is, if that's true, were they here to retrieve the modules or to destroy them? And how the hell would they know both modules were back together again? They were only brought together the one day. I was starting to give myself a headache thinking about all these possible scenarios. So I redirected my attention to what I had been doing, assessing the damage and how to properly fortify the property, as well as where best to focus my security cameras. On my way back to the den, I got to finally drop in on Frank to find out about his condition. Regrettably, no change. Now is about as good a time to hunker down and continue to write my story. I confess, I did have to retrieve my pocket reference from my truck in order to positively ascertain the correct date of that fateful night when all of our lives were so dramatically changed. Ah, there you go. Pocket reference. Anyways, well, no more muddled thoughts, migraines, or bizarre dreams for me, unless, of course, I eat a large pizza before going to bed. And that's not going to happen anytime soon, I imagine. But I am thinking much more clearly now, although I was seriously troubled by my recent revelation. Jason and Steve should be dropping by any time now to help me recount the events of that fateful night. I figure 3 eyewitness accounts of the same event might provide greater clarity to the story. I'm also thinking of putting a header or caption at the beginning of each section in order to help maintain some form of continuity and structure. More than just a routine trip up north, and it all began on Monday, August 19th, 1996. My typing and process of drifting back into my past memories seem to occur now almost simultaneously. Here's where I go into my self-thoughts, 3 little dots. Wow, I can actually see myself glancing down at the radio. The details are so vibrant and realistic. The display on the clock clearly indicated it was 9:20 p.m. Not a stirring or sound came from the back of the bunk on that fateful night. The boys had been talking for a while, but must have drifted off. I really couldn't blame the boys for crashing so early. It had, after all, been a long day for all of us. More so for me, but that was the nature of my job. I even remember sighing to myself, envying them. Besides, I could never really sleep in a moving truck, which pretty much meant I'd never be able to run team. In this trucking industry, it was expected of drivers to work long hours, especially LTL, which stands for less than truckload, or multiple drops, regardless of ministry regulations and logbook restrictions. Just don't get caught breaking the rules, and above all, don't have an accident. As was to be expected, any company I worked for would conveniently disavow any knowledge of my driving activities should an accident happen. It was the unwritten rules of the game, a game we are all expected to play out here. Over the years, I had learned to play their game very well. It's the same today as it was back then, the only difference being a lot more restrictions, more logbook enforcement, and considerably less pay. Even so, back then I found it difficult to stay fully awake and alert along that particular stretch of highway at night. I did it regardless, but it required considerable effort. Once it got dark, especially on a moonless night, there wasn't much to see or engage one's attention along that old highway. It was kind of spooky. Stopping at the watershed wasn't an option that night. The restaurant closed early on weekdays and didn't open early enough to accommodate me. It was only halfway between Dowling and Timmins along the 144 highway, over a 1.5 hour drive to the customer, and that was during the witching hours. Still, I had gotten my load off quicker back in Sudbury. Had I gotten my load off quicker back in Sudbury, I would have stopped there. An extra hour of sleep would have been sorely appreciated. As it turned out, the food at the Esso Truck Stop restaurant in Timmins was just as good and would be only a few minutes from my second customer. Now I'm coming out of myself thing. I vaguely recall that for some inexplicable reason, that night's early onset of darkness, brought on by the heavy overcast, blocking all of the almost full moon's light, had impressed upon me a scene of foreboding. The very darkness itself felt oppressive. I recall trying to dismiss those feelings as mere fatigue, aggravated by the sudden clouding over of the sky at dusk. Those black and ominous clouds completely swallowed up any trace of dim, any trace or dim of helpful evening light. Hell, even my headlights seemed to have difficulty penetrating that insufferable darkness. I remember having to strain my eyes just to make out the faint and vague outlines of shadows cast off by some of the jack pines, spruce, poplars, and occasional birch lining the solitary highway. Although, truth be told, I'm no arborist. Beyond that, there was what might have been a raccoon or rabbit darting through my headlights beam crossing the road, but there was little else to see. Oh yeah, a bear. I'm pretty sure I saw a bear plunge back into the sanctuary of the bush shortly after we had passed Kogama. Generally speaking, seeing a black bear along here was a rare occurrence. Now and then my truck seemed to narrowly skirt by the old blasted rock shelf. These were the rock walls that had been cut through years ago in order to level the terrain or to accommodate the highway's routing. Back then, the technique for cutting rock was rough blasting as opposed to the more uniform style of blasting employed today. That meant more uneven and jagged outcrops of rock along the edge of the highway. At night time, your eyes played tricks on you with the shadows cast off the rock walls by your headlights, especially after a long, tiring day like that day. That particular night, it seemed as if my mirrors were just narrowly avoiding the shaved outcrop of rock by mere feet, if not inches. In fact, all that really separated me and the boys from those jagged rock walls that seemed to reach out to us, the vast acres of muskeg, and worse, now that I consider it, were flimsy, knee-high wooden guardrail posts that ran alongside the narrow highway shoulders. Those were wooden posts strung with just 3 steel cables. Those barriers were barely capable of holding back an errant car, let alone restraining a big rig from going over the side. It was almost too scary to think about, so I tried not to back then. Now, as for the shoulder, that too was a misnomer, even a bad joke. It was at best 2 feet wide, consisting of loose tar-sprayed gravel. Enough space, perhaps, to provide some motorists in a car a marginal safety buffer should they be so unlucky to break down or get a flat along that desolate stretch of road. Perhaps just enough space to hopefully compensate for any driver's errors one might make in a car, but definitely not enough room for parking or standing on. As for trucks, loaded or otherwise, no space whatsoever. As I explained, those guardrails offered little, if any, consolation to me. Quite frankly, I always hated traveling that highway to Timmins because it was usually at night. Now I'd give anything to be back home and driving on it again, even at night. I smiled to myself as I reflected on how young the boys were back then. I knew they had had a long day, so I considered just letting them sleep. Although at the time their company would have been much appreciated. After all, I'd been driving since early that morning, and as I recall, I had to offload half the trailer by myself. Back into my self-thought. Got no help from those lazy unionized assholes at that grocery warehouse. I spent 2 hours waiting for a door, do all the work by myself, and now I'm bloody late to pick up the boys. Whoa! What just happened? I just now caught myself muttering out loud, actually muttering my resentment of those warehouse workers. The clarity of my refound memory was not just extraordinary, but a little unnerving. It was as if I was reliving the whole adventure again, like being drawn into a movie, almost like Last Action Hero with Arnold Schwarzenegger. Well, if we ever do get back, I'm making a movie of that whole adventure. Come to think of it, might not be such a bad idea to start incorporating some pictures and video footage into my personal documentary. I might even call it ABAJAM Chronicles. The documentary. Damn, I'm full of good ideas today. Yeah, you're full of it all right, I thought to myself. Just getting a little ahead of yourself, don't you think? So where was I? Oh yeah. With just a modicum of trepidation, I cautiously allowed myself to digress back to that fateful night. To be fair, it was my own fault having to offload the trailer by myself. I had let the boys go off to Dowling to visit their young friends when, in hindsight, I should have enlisted their help. After all, I arranged this little excursion for the boys. I was beginning to feel sorry for myself all over again. And as some of us were wont to do in such situations, I tried humoring myself by quoting that great philosopher Homer. No, not of the Iliad, but of The Simpsons, who would say under such circumstances, what are you going to do? Desperate times sometimes requires desperate measures. So how do I apply that philosophy and objective to these times in our current desperation? This time I got no answer and definitely nothing to laugh at. Or I could blame this catastrophe on the Union. Works for me. This was becoming a real exercise in starts, fits, and stops. Well, according to the monitor, my typing's not missing a beat or word. I felt relieved. I really didn't know if my fade-outs were hampering my writing. Didn't seem like it. I'll just go with the flow and hope for the best. Anyway, I remember on that particular night a local suburban radio station, just before it faded out of range, had predicted the possibility of heavy overcast skies and rain developing through the night. It seemed some unexpected and rapidly moving weather front from out of nowhere was rolling into the region. I paused what I was doing and gave serious reflection to that particular night's circumstances. Much like what happened last Sunday, now that I think about it. Was that merely coincidence? Uncertain of the answer, I resumed my writing, letting my mind once again gently drift back. Again, 3 dots. The announcer remarked that this was quite an unusual weather pattern rolling in so fast, and then proceeded to describe various possible weather patterns that might be contributing to his newly updated forecast. He went on to describe things like colliding weather fronts, which would produce anything from light drizzle and fog to potential heavy thunder showers and other meteorological babble. He had lost me and the devil in the details, but severe thunder showers and fog I readily understood. Makes for lousy driving conditions when you're really tired and feeling kind of grumpy. Or surly, excuse me. Unfortunately, few trucks and probably fewer cars would be crossing my path at that late hour. Other than breaking down, my only real concern would have been a front blowout or coming across a moose, as I've seen many a moose and deer on my runs. I had heard reports earlier that day over the CB there had been a significant increase in accidents involving moose, particularly in this region, and more specifically along this stretch of highway. Supposedly, there had even been a few fatalities. They weren't specific as to whether the fatalities were in their reference to the moose or the drivers. Probably both. I personally know several drivers who don't want to travel this region, case in point, like taking this particular run. Another driver refused it, so it was offered to me. I usually avoid them as well because most of the runs up here require driving through the night. I paused once again to reflect that when we lived up in Dowling, my job had me travel across Highway 17 every night back and forth to the Sioux. I did that for 7 long years. That was the primary catalyst, my having to drive constantly at night and sleep during the day, that contributed to my condition and eventual mental breakdown. At least it wasn't winter then. That adds a whole new dynamic to driving up there, especially along that stretch of highway. Again, no sooner had I paused than once more I found myself slipping back into that dark, rough stretch of highway. Slipping back onto that dark, rough stretch of highway. I had to shake my head for taking this run, even though taking it provided an opportunity for Jason, and Steve to reestablish their friendship. The things we do for our kids. At least I haven't come across any slow-moving tourists in their oversized campers or motorhomes. Passing along here could prove to be an exercise in utter futility, frustration, and even sheer madness. The real worry was seeing a moose in my headlights. That's something I do constantly worry about. It wouldn't be the first time I've encountered a moose in my direct path. Fortunately, those few memorable occasions were during the day, not at night, giving me lots of warning to stop. Aside from completely avoiding Mr. Moose, the best possible scenario, and all other outcomes were not so encouraging, especially along here. Anyways, okay. Not with having just 2 narrow driving lanes available to you and a 6 foot plus embankments on either side of the shoulder to roll down. Then at the end of those embankments, if you were lucky, a marshy bog or muskeg awaited you. Otherwise, depending on luck or lack of it, you might meet a stop-dead rock wall. Yeah, okay. Oh, well, I sighed forlornly. If the boys weren't going to keep me company and help me stay awake, perhaps the road will. What with all its winding, rough, and bumpy ride. Hell, this damn highway's so bad it feels like the frickin' steering wheel is going to shake right out of my hand. No wonder I need a new steering column when I get back to the shop. The noise was deafening at times. How did the boys sleep through it all? I wasn't too much further down the road when I noticed small portions of the highway's edge had either collapsed into a sinkhole or been washed away. Definitely not a good sign. Shit, talk about one neglected highway. And it could only get worse as I traveled further north, I thought with growing unease. I was now seriously contemplating recruiting an extra set of eyes when out of nowhere, wham! 3 more, wham, wham, wham! For all 3 axles, of course. Just my luck. My steering jerked violently at impact, while the whole cab shuddered and reverberated. I must have driven into an enormous pothole that had been hidden by a buildup of water on the surface of the road. The only thing that saved us from a front tire blowout was the water acting as a liquid cushion against the impact. That, and the fact that the front tires were Michelin's. The tractor's tires were less susceptible to damage. I don't know if it was shuddering impact or my barrage of expletives that followed, but it did prompt some stirring back in the bunk. Whoa! What was that, Mr. Meisner? Inquired the half-sleepy head that popped through the bunk's separating curtain. It was Stevie, Jason's best friend. Big pothole in the road. Couldn't miss it. Sorry about that. Where are we now? He inquired, rubbing one of his squinting sleepy eyes. Excuse me. We're a little better than halfway to Timmins, I guess. We just passed the watershed truck stop at Highway 560, perhaps 10 minutes ago. You boys have only been sleeping for little more than half an hour. You want to go back to sleep, go ahead, I said, all the while secretly hoping he wouldn't. Okay, was his only reply, and he disappeared behind the bunk curtain. Oh well, nice try, stupid. I resigned myself to driving alone for the night. Oh, excuse me while I pause this video. Well, I'm back. Oh, sorry about that. I just had to check and see how many pages there are in this chapter. I might have to cut it in half. Both boys had crawled into the bunk somewhere between Cartier and the watershed after we had supper at the Windy Lake restaurant. My original plans where we'd meet and eat at the Dowling Tavern where I was scheduled to pick them up. Okay, my original plans was to, my original plans were we'd meet and eat at the Dowling Tavern where I was scheduled to pick them up. I fondly recollected how, in another life, I played on the tavern's slow pitch league. So how was I supposed to know the tavern had closed its doors? Both boys looked pretty distraught when I pulled into the parking lot around 6:30 that evening, only to realize we wouldn't be eating there. There aren't too many decent places to eat traveling north on Highway 144, especially at night. We were all relieved and glad when I spotted an available parking spot off on the dirt shoulder across from the Windy Lake restaurant and motel. There was just one truck, a UPS, pulling a pair of pup trailers that was occupying the other spot. It wasn't really a bona fide parking spot, but when you're over 70 feet long, you make do. I'm amazed most of us truckers don't get ticketed more often considering the parking liberties we take. The restaurant not only served the community, but also the campers at nearby Windy Lake Provincial Park. During the summer months, it always enjoyed brisk business because it was licensed. As you walk in and turn right, you see there are approximately 16 gray top tables with enough chrome and brown vinyl chairs to accommodate up to 32 patrons. We only needed one table and 3 chairs. The restaurant's decor, like the menu, was simple but tasteful. 8 large pine-framed glass windows provided good viewing of the highway and my truck. Pine wainscoting followed the walls between the windows, and the grain-louvered blinds hung on either side. And green louvered blinds hung on either side. An ornamental antique-faced wood pendulum clock hung on the wall facing the highway. 2 mounted pick rolls hung high on the wall adjacent to Old Cartier Road that led to the park. There was an aging TV perched on top of the double-door white fridge that contained a good variety of pop and pies. The beer cooler sat beside the fridge. Above it was a cabinet made of dark brown wood, which contained the liquor. The selection of beers, 6 to be exact, was displayed on top of the cabinet. We had intended to sit in the corner by the window looking in the direction of the truck, when who should call out to us but Liz and Brian, old friends and neighbors when we had lived on River Road. We sat together in opposite corners along the wall that displayed the menu board. In the course of our conversation, we learned they were camping for the week while their kids, both Jason and Stevie's age, were off at camp. This was one of the nice things about living in Dowling. You're only 9 miles from the park. Forget the can opener? Be home and back within half an hour. There was much to talk about and not enough time to properly catch up, especially when trying to enjoy a quick meal. The meals were simple fare but good and hearty. I had the turkey rice soup, just a little too salty, as well as a club sandwich. Both boys had huge hamburgers with all the fixings, including a generous portion of fries. The meal gave me the chance to relax and forget about how the day had gone. Meeting Liz and Brian there made the occasion all the more delightful. I did envy Brian, as he was enjoying a beer with his meal, while I had to settle for a few cups of so-so coffee. Service, as usual, was prompt, our waitress polite, even jovial, and the food came quickly, so we were able to leave about an hour after our arrival. I didn't want to give the meal a chance to settle and tire me out, or a bear to come by and possibly give me a ticket, so the sooner we got rolling, the better. We said our goodbye, promised to stay in touch, and soon the 3 of us were rolling up the highway. As I had previously mentioned, not much to see or do after that. Hell, Gogama hasn't much to see at any time of the day, let alone on a cloudy night. Even the telephone poles stopped following the highway from that point. What few radio stations there were up there faded quickly once you got beyond the Sudbury Basin, especially at night. That's why I always preferred to travel that highway whenever possible during the daylight hours. In the trucking industry, I'm what's known as a solar-powered driver. At least in daylight hours, you got to see the ruggedly beautiful landscape of northern Ontario. There was the diversity of flora and fauna, which you just don't see at night. Thick stands of spruce and balsams, evergreens, poplars, and birch, all seeming to grow out of a shallow rock soil that would barely support a backyard garden. Amidst the rocky landscape were the small isolated lakes, fed by crystal clear streams, the countless rice grass choked bogs and muskeg that would suddenly appear on one side of the highway and then on the other side. Now and again during the day, you'd see some wildlife swimming on or paddling through the cold waters of a lake or a shallow bog, if not obscured by tall grass or reeds. Numerous species of ducks, geese, cranes, and other birds could be sighted, as well as some deer, muskrats, and the occasional beaver. You might even spot a black bear ambling off into the cover of the brush, as I mentioned seeing earlier. There was a wonderful assortment of creatures, both small and great, that made their home up there in the rugged and austere wilderness. Another advantage was that I got to read all those endless testimonies inscribed with colorful paint on the slate gray rock walls, some fading with time, of undying love and home, along with the names of the countless travelers who over the years passed that way. There's Bill loves Janet, Bobby, eternally yours, Sandy, 83. Leroy was here, Frank, Johnny, Jimmy, Newfoundland, July 1996. Alf and Debbie, Toronto, 1970, and so on. I can't forget to mention the numerous Inukshuks, small stone sentinels that stood guard along either side of the highway. These were curious miniature rock monuments, neatly stacked and balanced, and usually situated on a flat elevated crown of rock wall. This is strictly a Canadian phenomenon, or so I've read. The Inukshuk is an Inuit tradition. It's supposed to guide them like a slingshot, like a signpost, or serve as a cache for food out on the lonely barren tundra. Sometimes they were used to mark sacred locations. Well, whatever they were meant to be, I just don't ever want to be lost or so hungry as to actually need one to survive. I sometimes imagined those little monuments were like little altars built back in biblical times, a simple testament that some anonymous traveler had passed this way, just like some of the old biblical patriarchs had done years ago. They would build an altar in the course of their journeys, sacrifice an unblemished animal to God in appreciation for Him getting them safely this far, and then move on. Again, the three dots. I let my thoughts wander over the whole curiosity of travelers in the past erecting altars and modern travelers needing to erect inukshuks. Or if they even knew the story and significance behind erecting an altar or an inukshuk. How about after constructing one of those roadside altars? How about after constructing one of those roadside altars? Would it have been accompanied by some form of traditional ceremony, a frenzied dance, a mandatory sacrificing of an unblemished animal? Nah, somehow I doubt it. There was certainly no shortage of roadkill tonight. I had spotted the carcass of a deer off on the shoulder, albeit slightly bruised and definitely not too clean, I jokingly amused. Oh well, I had to sigh. It was my desperate attempt at trying to lighten up the night. One thing about this job, you definitely do a lot of self-speak. It wasn't long before I found myself brooding over the darkness and sense of isolation that I found myself saying, you know, I sure could use an inukshuk right about now. At that time, as a precaution, I decided to cut my speed back to just below 75 kilometers. I was taking into consideration the condition of the road and the very real possibility of coming across a moose. No sense tempting fate twice in one night, certainly not with two young boys aboard. Besides, I didn't need the added momentum of speed to negotiate these hits. I was startled by the high-pitched but soft voice of Stevie behind my right shoulder. You okay, Mr. Meisner? He inquired pensively as he emerged from behind the curtain and casually slid into the passenger seat. Instinctively, he fastened the seatbelt without me having to tell him to do so. Yeah, I'm okay. So what gets you up as if I didn't know? He replied he couldn't get back to sleep. This road's way too bumpy, he remarked. Besides, I never slept in a truck before, so I'm not really used to all the moving and bouncing around. Doesn't seem to bother Jason, though. He's been with me a few times before, I explained to him. He's sort of used to it by now. Stevie just nodded and sat quietly staring out into the mist and foggy shouldered blackness beyond his window. He was a good-looking young boy for 14, with thick reddish-brown hair, excuse me, more from his mother's side than his father's. He was as tall as Jason, which didn't say much because both boys were a little stunted for their age. Stevie had just recently turned 14 and was 13 months older than my son Jason. By this time, they had been best friends for over 7 years, almost as soon as Jason started public school in Dowling. That first September, we moved up here from Mississauga. Stevie had been held back a year at school due to circumstances at home. I never did find out the exact reason, but it was probably the same reason his older brother Sean lost 2 years. In many regards, Stevie was like his older brother. In many regards, Stevie was like the older brother my son Jason never had. There weren't many other boys their age to play with when we lived on the farm in Dowling back then. Excuse me while I pause it. Sorry, had to scratch my nose and give myself another drink. I'm going to read to the next, you'll see the little, can you see the little hyphens, little dots? I'm going to read to the next 3 dots. And then we'll split this chapter in half because it's a long chapter. Once again, I emerged from my dreamlike reverie, pausing my typing, but continuing my reflection of how Jason, Stevie, the Vaniers, and my family's lives had become so intertwined. Over the years, they've been inseparable, each one spending as much time at the other's house as at their own, much like today. Unfortunately, since last Sunday, Stevie and his family no longer have a choice in the matter. I sighed, feeling somewhat distraught, and thought, I just hope familiarity doesn't breed contempt between them, or between any of us, because here right now, we're all we've got. Looking back again at that night, I remember Stevie didn't seem interested in conversing, having just woke up and all. I began thinking about his family, their circumstances, and how extremely different all our lives were. Stevie's folks were never as well off as we were, which doesn't really say much. Over the years, though, we always managed to live in a comfortably decent apartment or a rented house. It helps when you have a regular and decent paying job. I was always fortunate in that regard. When we first moved to Dowling, I had the good fortune of finding and renting a quaint farmhouse. It was an old 2-story, 4-bedroom, white clapboard farmhouse. The property came with a large rustic gray barn with hay loft, 2 smaller wood storage sheds, and a large shady oak tree in front. It was neatly situated on 50 acres of land, a corner property not too far from the very highway we were now traveling on. In contrast, Stevie and his family lived in an old aluminum-clad house trailer between us and Chelmsford. At the rear of the trailer there was a rough built-on addition comprised of plywood and old siding that made up an extra bedroom for one of the sons. There was no basement to speak of, but the property did provide one small, run-down barn where Bill did his tinkering. One boast the Vaniers could make was that they owned the property their trailer was situated on. As well, Stevie's mother, Jackie, did own a riding horse. But when your father can't keep a steady job, you just don't get a lot of material things. So it happened that over the years, Jason and Stevie shared almost everything. There were always things to do, adventures to go on, a horse, an old tractor or ATV that Bill had fixed to ride on. One of Bill's better attributes was that he could fix and restore any kind of vehicle, so there was always a ride to be had at the Vaniers. Bernie and I delivered on the gifts and other forms of entertainment like paying for movies or carnival rides. Now and again, we'd get together for a combined family picnic. Anyways, as I was saying, that's going to be it for this week. I apologize that I didn't read the whole chapter, but it's a big chapter, and I got a pool to fill and check up on. So, until next week, all of you have a good week, and we'll see you in 7 days. Okay. Oh, I've been sitting too long. Good night.